I'm really excited to be here with you all today. My name is Jenny Pugesek. I am a conservation biologist on the endangered species team at Xerces. In my current role, I'm one of the coordinators of the Bumblebee Atlas in the Midwestern United States. But today, I am going to be talking to you about some of the work that I did before I came to Xerces when I was a grad student. So, before we start talking about bumblebees and nesting and overwintering, I just want to acknowledge some of the folks who made all of this work possible. I would like to thank my grad student advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Crone, for her mentorship, and the entire Crone Lab group for all of their support while I was in grad school. I'd like to also acknowledge all of my collaborators on the research projects I did, my whole field crew of undergrads, and then all of the land managers and owners who let us do surveys on their property. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Claudio Graton and the Graton Lab group for all of their support when I was out in Wisconsin. So to give you guys an outline of what we'll be discussing today, I'm going to start off things by giving you a quick introduction to bumblebees and to their life history, and then we'll discuss what we know about bumblebee nesting and overwintering. After that, I'll talk you through two field-based studies that I worked on when I was in grad school, and then to wrap things up, we'll talk a little bit about how you can get involved with research in this area. All right, so I'm sure that many of you in the audience are familiar with bumblebees. They are some of the most charismatic and well-studied pollinators in the United States. Bumblebees are really important animals. They're really important pollinators in both our ecological and agricultural systems, and there are a lot of reasons for this. Bumblebees are great pollinators because they are social insects. So bumblebees live in colonies with a queen and lots of workers. And those colonies are long-lived. They are active basically through the whole growing season. And so for that reason, bumblebees can provide pollination services during the summer, during the fall, during the spring, at lots of different times. Bumblebees are also generalists. They can forage on lots of different types of flowers, and so they provide pollination services to lots of different types of flowers. Bumblebees are also cold adapted. They can fly when it's chilly out, when it's even a little bit drizzly. Um, and so, for that reason, they are really important pollinators of some of our spring blooming flowers that are blooming when it's a little cold outside. Bumblebees also can buzz pollinate. So this is a behavior that some bees can engage in when they are visiting flowers. They'll basically shake their bodies really, really hard when they are at a flower, and that is great for some species of plants. They need that buzz pollination to shake the pollen off those anthers. So bumblebees are really ecologically and economically important animals. Unfortunately, many bumblebee species are at risk. There are about 50 species of bumblebees in North America, and about a quarter of these are considered to be either threatened or in a near threatened category. So, folks ask me all the time, why are bumblebees declining? For insects, there are many stressors that can lead to declines. So things like climate change, increased pesticide use, changing disease pressure, and habitat loss. So these stressors are cumulative. They often exacerbate each other. So scientists often refer to this as a death by a thousand cut situation. What that means is that even for species that are declining primarily due to things like climate change, it's still really important to protect their habitats. We want to make sure that we're protecting their remaining habitat because if they lose more habitat, that's just kicking them when they're already down. And then, as I mentioned, of course, habitat loss is also a major driver of declines. And so we really want to make sure that we're protecting and enhancing the habitats for these animals if we care about these threatened species. Most efforts to maintain habitat for pollinators focuses on enhancing floral resources, which is super important. Bumblebees need flowers for food. They collect pollen and nectar from flowers, and that's what they eat. So foraging resources are a key component of bumblebee habitat. However, there are other types of resources that bumblebees need during different phases of their life cycle. So, as I mentioned, bumblebees are social insects. They live in colonies with a queen and lots of workers, but they also have a solitary phase of their life cycles. So, that starts with overwintering. Bumblebees will find a place to spend the winter all by themselves. They dig out their own hibernacula, typically in the soil, just a few centimeters down. So they spend the winter all alone, and when it starts to warm up outside, then they'll emerge from hibernation. The queens will need to forage a little bit so that they can develop their ovaries, but shortly after emerging from hibernation, they'll need to find a place to nest. So that nest site is where the queen will start her very own colony. In the spring, you may notice queens flying really low across the ground in a zigzag pattern. Those are queens that are nest searching, so they're looking for a place to start their colonies and nest. Bumblebees are cavity nesters, so they need to find an existing cavity that's large enough to house their whole colony. Now, once the queen has found a suitable nest site, she can establish her colony. So she'll collect pollen and nectar, food for her babies, and lay her eggs on that food source, and then those eggs will hatch into workers, and the colony will grow through the summer. So the first cohort of workers usually emerges sometime in the early summer or late spring. That colony will grow and grow and grow and grow, producing more workers until sometime in the late summer, early fall, at which the colony will switch into reproduction. So instead of producing more workers, the colony will produce queens and drones. The queens and drones, so those are the reproductive males and females, will mate, and then the queens will go off and find a place to overwinter, whereas the rest of the colony, so the old queen, the workers, the drones, they will all die. So it's only those queens that are going off to survive until the next year, at least in temperate systems. So when we study bumblebees, we are often focusing on what's going on with the workers. But if we're just focusing on workers, we're missing a big part of the picture. And I think it's really important to make sure that we're providing bees with both nesting and for overwintering resources, as well as foraging resources. Okay, so one of the reasons that we know so little about nesting and overwintering is because nest sites and overwintering sites are really hard to find. You know, this stuff is all happening underneath the ground. If you want to, say, find a nest site, what you need to do is look for bumblebee worker activity outside of the nest entrance. And I'm going to show you guys just a quick video of what that looks like. The nest entrance is right there. That white arrow is pointing to it. And you're going to see a worker bee enter the nest site in this video. So there we see a worker bee flying into her nest. And if you want to find a nest site, that's the main thing that you're looking for. So they're pretty hard to find. A lot of what we know about bumblebee nesting and overwintering comes from anecdotal observations. So basically, somebody stumbles upon a nest somewhere, say they find a nest in a fur coat in a shed in New Zealand, and then they publish that information because that's all we know about nesting for bumblebees. So these observations are by a source of data. People are going to stumble upon nests in places where they spend the most time. But there are still things that we can learn from these types of observations. So for the next part of this talk, I want to give you guys an overview about what we generally know about bumblebee nesting and overwintering. So we'll start off by talking about where bumblebees nest. So as I mentioned earlier, bumblebees are cavity nesters. They can use lots of different types of materials as nesting substrate, things like rodent burrows or nests, bird nests or bird houses. Some bumblebees will use tree stumps or rotten logs or hollow trees to nest in. And you'll also find bumblebee nests in more anthropogenic environments, like a compost pile or in the insulation of a wall. Right, so basically they need a shelter and they need some type of insulating material so that they can control the temperature of their brood. So something like the fluffy stuff in a rodent nest or wall insulation in a wall. So for the most part, bumblebees don't construct their own nest. They need to find an existing shelter that they can then co-opt. There are some exceptions to this. There are a few species of tropical bumblebees that actually collect leaf litter and construct these conical mounds of vegetation over their brood. And this is a waterproof, basically roof. So those are species that are going out and actually collecting vegetation. So they're a little different than some of our more temperate species, which are primarily relying on existing shelters. And I would say the tropical bumblebees are kind of more of the exception than the rule. So bumblebees can be found in different nest positions relative to the ground. So some bumblebee nests will be found above the ground, so places like hollow trees or bird's nest. They're not making any contact with the surface of the ground at all. Some bumblebee nests can be found on the surface of the ground, so they brood is resting on top of the ground or in like a shallow indent in the ground, and then they have insulating material covering the brood, so something like thatchy grass or moss that's protecting them from the elements. And the last place that you can find bumblebee nests is below the ground. So subterranean nests are completely beneath the ground. They are surrounded by earth. These are places like rodent burrows um, or tunnels. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot we can learn from anecdotal observations, especially when we put them all together. So I want to walk you through the results of a project that I did when I was in grad school focused on characterizing nesting traits of bumblebees using the historic literature. Right, so this study is what we call a meta-analysis, and this is where you take results or data from lots and lots of different studies and pool it together to address a research question. So for this study, we found 316 documents that describe locating bumblebee nests. So these include research papers, but also things like natural history notes or reports where people described bumblebee nest sites. And from these documents, we were able to pull 2,510 records of nests representing 97 different species. We extracted a lot of information from these studies about bumblebee nesting, but we focused our analysis on exploring nesting habitat associations at two spatial scales: nest position and the land cover type that the nest was found in. So first off, let's talk about nest positions. Right, so this figure here shows ground position associations of bumblebees mapped to the bumblebee phylogeny. So I know there's a lot going on in this figure. I'm going to try to walk you through it slowly. Right, so all of the species represented in our data set are listed here. Right, they are mapped to a phylogenetic tree, which you can think of as being a lot like a family tree, but at an evolutionary scale. So species that are more closely related are grouped together. So on the right-hand side, we have which subgenus that the species listed belongs to. Our results are also color-coded based on subgenera. Right, so the different colored dots, all the purple dots are results for species in the genus Pyrobombus, uh, and so on and so forth. Right, so the dots in the middle, this is what I really want you to focus on. So for each species, these dots show what proportions of nests are found in each ground position. So bigger dots correspond to a bigger proportion. So if a dot is bigger in the below ground column, that means that a species is more of a below ground nester. All right, so the first takeaway here from these results is that most of the nests reported in our study were found below ground. We see the most big dots in that below ground column, followed by surface nests, and then above ground nests were the rarest ground position. All right, so the second big takeaway here is that ground position associations of nests are specific to each species. So we have some species that tend to nest under the ground. For example, the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, is more of a ground nesting species. We see a bigger dot under that. For that leftmost dot is the biggest one, indicating that that's a below ground nesting species. We also have some species that are more likely to nest on the surface of the ground. So the yellow bumblebee, Bombus fervidus, that's more of a surface nester. And then we have some species that nest above ground. So the tree bumblebee, Bombus hypnorum, that is a species that we found primarily above the ground. We also found that nesting positions were somewhat generalizable across subgenera. So we see a lot of variation within each subgenera. So for example, Pyrobombus, we see that there are some species which are surface nesting, there are some species which are more above ground nesting, there's some that are subterranean. Those little dots are kind of all over the place. But there are still some interesting patterns. For example, bumblebees in the genus Bombus sensu stricto, tended to be mostly below ground nesting. And then we have, in contrast, lots of surface nesting species in the subgenus Thyracobombus. So many species of conservation concern belong to these two subgenera. Bombus stricto, we have species like the rusty patch bumblebee and the western bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee. And then in Thyracobombus, we have the American bumblebee and yellow bumblebee. We did a similar analysis to explore whether or not there were any species-specific patterns in terms of land cover as well. And we did notice some differences in land cover associations across species, but there weren't any generalizations that we could make across subgenera. So most nests were found in open areas, so places like pastures or shrublands like heaths or grasslands. Nests were also found pretty commonly in forests and also in places like structures, so in a shed or in a wall, developed open areas, so places like roadsides and lawns, and then in croplands, so banana plantations, rye fields, rice paddies, all of those would fall under croplands. Okay, so I think this is really valuable, but it's a lot harder to make inferences about land cover associations from this kind of data because this is highly dependent on where people are generally looking for bumblebee nests. All right, so some key takeaways about bumblebee nesting, uh, just to review what we've talked about. Bumblebees are cavity nesting animals that are mostly relying on existing nesting substrate to use as nest sites. But many bumblebees are flexible in their nesting habitat use. However, we still see differences in patterns of habitat use across species, which are somewhat generalizable across subgenera. All right, so next let's talk about overwintering. I think one of the best syntheses of overwintering habitat comes from this paper out of the Cola Lab group, Systematic Review of Nesting and Overwintering Habitat of Bumblebees. It does a really good job of consolidating all of the information that we know about nesting and overwintering habitat. So I'm mostly going to be talking about results from this study. Um, there are only about 10 studies which describe overwintering habitat for bumblebees. So the information that we're working with here is pretty sparse, but once again, there are still things that we can learn from this sparse information. So bumblebee queens excavate their own hibernacula. I'm going to show you guys a quick video of what that looks like. So in case you can't see it, there is a queen bumblebee doing a little bit of digging there in the soft soil. And what she's doing is digging out her own little place to spend the winter. All right, so all of the overwintering queens that we have records of have been found underneath the ground. Typically, they're 2 to 15 centimeters deep in the loose soil or just underneath the leafy duff. They have been found in both shaded areas under trees, as well as more open areas and places like banks. Often they are found on north-facing slopes, but they've also been found on flat places and in slopes facing other directions too. I also want to mention that there is at least one species of bumblebee that seems to overwinter in large aggregations. The common eastern bumblebee is a species which overwinters close to its natal nest site. So around the nest entrance, you can find large numbers of overwintering queens just underneath the soil. So pictured here are two records of these aggregations. So some historic data regarding the species overwintering near its nest site, and then also a modern observation. So this is from Twitter. So really cool feature of this species' life history. Uh, we don't really know if any other species overwinter in large aggregations like this, but for at least one species, it seems like they do overwinter in big groups, which is really cool. All right, so some key takeaways regarding bumblebee overwintering. Bumblebees dig out their own overwintering sites, often just a few centimeters below the surface. Uh, they are overwintering in the soil. Um, and queens of at least one species may be overwintering in large aggregations around their nest entrances. But I think the biggest takeaway regarding overwintering habitat is that we really need more data here. We have a lot of really big knowledge gaps when it comes to this stage of the bumblebee life cycle. Okay. So if we want to better understand the habitat needs of bumblebees, we really need more formal studies on bumblebee nesting and overwintering. So for this next part of the talk, I want to tell you about two field-based studies that I worked on when I was in grad school focused on nesting bumblebees. All right, so the first field study I'm going to be telling you about today was conducted in Ipswich, Massachusetts. We wanted to evaluate nesting habitat for bumblebees by locating nests directly on the landscape. Right, so the results of this study are published. So if you're interested in checking out the paper, um, it's an open access article. So even if you don't have access to a university library or something like that, you can still read the paper if you'd like to. Right. So sort of big picture, we don't really know that much about how land use and land management impact nesting bumblebees. From anecdotal observations, we know that bumblebees nest in places like forests and grasslands, or even places like croplands, but we really don't know if those are good places for bumblebees to nest. Presence-only data is biased towards places that we spend a lot of time. So when we evaluate nesting habitats for bumblebees, we want to account for our search effort. We want to know where bumblebees are nesting, but we also want to know where we aren't finding any nests when we're evaluating an entire landscape. Right. So the goal of our project was to estimate bumblebee nest densities in different land cover types. For this project, we focused on the common eastern bumblebee because it was one of the most common species in our region. We thought we might actually be able to find some nests of this species. Right, so the map that you see here is a map of one of our field sites, Appleton Farms and Grass Rides. This is actually one of the oldest, or the oldest continuously working farms in the United States. It was established in 1638, which is super wild, but it's now being run as a conservation farm. So you can see from this map that there are lots of different land cover types represented. We have forested and wooded areas. We have rangeland for cattle. We have some croplands, and we also have some more natural grasslands with more native species. For this study, we focused on 3 different land cover types, all of which are managed in different ways. So we had 2 land cover types that were grasslands, hayfields, which were mowed 1 to 3 times each summer and hayed. And we also did some surveys in meadows, which were more of a natural or native grassland community. They had native species like little bluestem, and these were mowed once at the end of each growing season to prevent invasives and woody plants from taking over, but they weren't hayed. And then lastly, we had forests and woodlands. So we set up survey plots in each one of these different land cover types. Each one of these plots was 1,500 square meters. And we set up 60 plots across our study sites, so about 20 plots in each land cover type. So when we went and surveyed a plot for nesting bumblebees, what we did was walk really slowly through our survey plot, looking for worker activity outside of nest entrances. So we wanted to know how many nests were in each of these plots, which is really hard when nests are hard to find. Our ability to detect nests is imperfect. Every time we went out to a plot, it's not like we're going to find every single nest that's there because the nests are really cryptic. So to account for imperfect detection, we use what we call a mark resite study. So rather than going out and surveying a plot just once, we visited each plot on multiple occasions, recorded which nests we found during each one of our surveys. So from that data, we could build what we call capture history for each nest. Right? So we know when we did and didn't find a nest in our study area. So from this data, we can determine the probability we would find a nest given it was in one of our survey plots. And this is really important. Accounting for imperfect detection is necessary if you are surveying in areas where you are more or less likely to find nests. Our ability to find nest sites was context dependent. Um, we were less likely to find a nest if it was in a forest compared to if it was in a meadow. So if a nest was in a meadow, the likelihood that we would find that nest during a survey was about 50%. For forests, it was more like 30% because forests have a lot more stuff going on in the landscape. There are trees in the way, there's lots of vegetation. You just can't see quite as far when you're walking through a forest. But because we were able to estimate detection probability in these two different land cover types, we could account for that when we're making our calculations of how many nests were in the plots. Right, so we know how likely we are to find nests, and we know how many nests we found. So from that, we can figure out how many total nests there were in a given area, even if we weren't able to find some of them. And what we found was that the common eastern bumblebee nest densities were really low in hayfields. We didn't find a single common eastern bumblebee nest in a hayfield during our study in either year. Uh, we did find common eastern bumblebee nests in both meadows and forests at similar rates. So comparable nest densities in those two more natural land cover types. So the big conclusion here for the common eastern bumblebee was that the nest densities were comparable in forests and meadows, and we saw a larger number of nests in these two land cover types when compared to hayfields. Now, the common eastern bumblebee wasn't the only type of bumblebee that we found during our surveys. We actually found 51 nests in total when we were out there looking for them. Um, And if we look at the patterns of nesting habitat use for the different species we encounter, we see that their habitat use patterns are species specific. So we found, in addition to the common eastern bumblebee, which is here in green, uh, 4 other species of bumblebees. Most of these species we only found a couple nests for, but we found a lot of brown-belted bumblebees as well. And interestingly, unlike the common eastern bumblebee, we mostly found brown-belted bumblebee nests in meadows. We found only one brown-belted bumblebee nest in a forest, and that actually happened to be in a tree fall where there was a little bit of grass growing. So what is good for one species might not necessarily be good for all species of bumblebees. Right. So I also have done bumblebee nest surveys in some other regions of the US. I currently live in the Midwestern United States and have done some surveys for nests out here. So I want to talk a little bit about that research. The results of this next study I'm going to be talking about aren't published. It's really more of a pilot study, but I do think our results are really cool, so I'm excited to share them with you all. When I moved to the Midwest, I was really, really excited to try to look for nests because the Midwestern United States is one of the few places where you can find the endangered rusty patch bumblebee. So this is a species that was once really widespread across the eastern United States. Um, Unfortunately, it has undergone major, major declines, and it really can be found in just a few regions now. The upper Midwest is one of them. Honestly, low-key, I moved to the upper Midwest because rusty patch bumblebee is still here. They're a really cool species, and I was really excited to try to look for nests in this area. So most of my prior work had been with really common species. I really wanted to see if we could use similar methods to find uncommon species as well. So our goals with this study were to conduct bumblebee nest density surveys within the current range of Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee, and then hopefully find rusty patch bumblebee as well. So we did this work at 5 different field sites in southern Wisconsin. All of the properties we were working at were conservation parks, which were managed with fire. So prescribed fire is a really important management tool in the Midwest. Land managers will use periodic burns in places like grasslands and even forests to do things like keep out invasives and prevent woody plants from taking over. These are generally really low intensity burns, so just the understory beneath the trees is being burned. Most of the time, these burns are happening in the spring or late fall when the weather is cooler, so you don't get really intense fire. So at each site, we set up survey plots in different in areas with different management. So we set up survey plots in wooded areas. We set up some survey plots in open areas that were spring burned, and then we also set up some plots uh, in open areas that were not spring burned. So we set up a total of 34 plots, which varied by size. Some of our plots were smaller, around a half of a hectare. Some of them were pretty big, around 5 hectares, but we walked through them at a continuous rate. So the amount of time that we spent searching a plot depended on how big it was. So during this study, we found a total of 15 bumblebee nests, 4 different species. We found mostly Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. We also found some black and gold bumblebee nests and red-belted bumblebee nest. And we also found a rusty patch bumblebee nest, which is super exciting. So the rusty patch bumblebee nest was in a open woodland. Um, it was below the ground. You can see a picture of that nest site here. So right there is the nest entrance. It's kind of a big one. And then right here, right underneath it, you can see there is a rusty patch bumblebee queen returning to the nest site. So we're really excited to find this nest. I was incredibly pumped. Looking back on our goals, the goal of this study was really to see if we could try to find Aphanus nests. We did look in areas that had been spring burned and then areas that weren't spring burned, but we didn't set up our study to try to understand the impacts of prescription fire. I think you would need a lot more data to do that, and this was really just a pilot study. But I do think it's really interesting that we found very few nests in areas that had been recently burned. Uh, so I don't want you all to walk away from this talk with the impression that prescribed fire is bad for bumblebees. Prescription fire is incredibly important as a land management tool. It helps prevent invasives. It helps prevent woody plants from taking over. It helps enhance floral resources, which are something that bumblebees need. But prescription fire is also a source of disturbance, and it does have the potential to destroy bumblebee nesting substrate. So we have here a picture of a vole nest that has been recently burned. And as you can see, quite a lot of the grassy material that makes up that vole nest has been burnt up. So we do need to think about prescription fire and how we're implementing it so that we can best enhance habitat for bumblebees. We have a lot to learn about the impacts of fire on bumblebees. I also want to mention that our results also broadly align with ongoing research in this region. And I just want to give a shout out to Jake Kachansky, who is a grad student in the Graton Lab at UW-Madison. She is doing some really amazing work exploring how nesting resources change with time since last prescribed burn in restored prairies. She's been working in this study system for a very long time, and she's going to graduate this year. So hopefully you'll be seeing her research soon. But just as a teaser, she has found that in the year of a burn and the year following, bumblebee nests are rare. And the nests that she has observed have been for below ground nesting species like the common eastern bumblebee or the black and gold bumblebee. 3 years post-burn and later, she has been regularly finding nests of both below ground and surface nesting species. So a little bit more evidence that prescription fire can impact bumblebee nesting habitats, and that doing things like using rotational burn strategies could be really important for bumblebees. So if you are interested in burns or prescription fire, I definitely recommend keeping an eye out for her research. It's really cool, super neat study. Right. So even with all of this ongoing research, there is still so much we need to learn about bumblebee nesting and overwintering. So I thought I would wrap up this talk by telling you about how you can get involved with research in this area. Right, so if you happen to find a bumblebee nest or an overwintering site, you can share that data with researchers. There are multiple community science programs in the US where you can share your observations of overwintering, queens, or nesting bumblebees. The first one I want to mention is Queen Quest. So this is a project that is focused on collecting data on overwintering queen bumblebees. So if you go to www.queenquest.org, you can fill out a form to share the information that you found about an overwintering queen. So if you're digging in your garden and you happen to find a overwintering queen, or if you see a queen bumblebee digging out their overwintering site, take a picture, watch it for a little while, and please check out the form. We definitely encourage you to fill it out and share your observations with us. The other program I want to mention is Bumblebee Watch. So Bumblebee Watch is a platform for submitting observations of bumblebees. It's a little bit like iNaturalist, if you're familiar with iNaturalist. You take photos of the animal that you spot and then upload them. Uh, with Bumblebee Watch, you have the option of submitting a nest observation. So if you go to Bumblebee Watch and submit your data, you can select, I want to report a nest, and then from there you can upload photos of the nest that you've taken. You can fill out some information about the habitat that the nest was found in, what colony traffic was like. So if you do happen to find a nest, I encourage you to submit your observation to Bumblebee Watch. Um, for many bumblebee species, incidental observations are one of our only sources of data on nesting. So, please check out Bumblebee Watch if you haven't already. All right, the last program that I want to give a shout out to is the Minnesota Bumblebee Nest Quest project. So this is a new project focused on going out and doing formal surveys for bumblebee nests. It's right now just in Minnesota. Last year was just in the Twin Cities area, and I think potentially they may be expanding this year, but it is regionally specific. But if you are in Minnesota, I definitely encourage you to check this program out. If you go to nestquest.umn.edu/about, it will take you to the project website. And I encourage you all to, even if you're not going to engage with a community science project like NestQuest, to keep your eye out for nesting and overwintering bumblebees, um, or to go out and look for them. I find looking for bumblebee nests to be really meditative and really lovely. Just spending time outside, looking for these sort of cryptic, secret nests. And it's a really fun way to spend an afternoon. Right, and I think that wraps up my talk. If you guys would like to contact me with any questions, my contact information is here. My name is Genevieve Pugesek, and you can reach me at Genevieve at Xerces.org. And super happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Jenny. We have a lot of questions, so we're going to try to just get through as many as we can. I doubt we'll get through all of them today, but we are going to go after the hour today. Jenny has generously offered her time, so I'm just going to kick us off with Elizabeth's question, and several other people had the same question. Is there more than one queen produced at the end of the summer from a single nest that overwinters?
Yeah, so that is a great question. So just to clarify, the nests themselves aren't overwintering. The nests are the colonies are basically active during the growing season, and then at the end of the year, they expire. So the bumblebees aren't using the nest sites during the winter. They are going to a separate place to overwinter. But yes, so the bumblebee colonies themselves are, if they're successful, going to produce lots and lots of queens. So ideally for a bumblebee colony, they will be producing lots of reproductives at the end of the year, lots of queens, lots of drones. But not every colony succeeds. Some of them die before they're able to grow really big, or some of them may just produce drones. So it really depends on how well the colony is doing.
Thanks for that answer, Jenny. Okay, moving right along. Again, so many questions. We'll try and get to as many as we can. Is it just the queen that spends the winter alone, or do other types of bees also overwinter?
Yeah, so um, what I covered is really specific to bumblebees. So bumblebee queens overwinter alone, and bumblebees are social bees. Most of the bees that are native in the United States are solitary, so they don't have a colony the way that bumblebees do. So they're spending, their whole lives alone, basically. Um, the so, for other bee species, they're going to be using different types of substrates to overwinter in. So we have some bees that nest in stems. Those are stem nesting bees. They overwinter in the stems too. So they overwinter in their nests. They're solitary. They're not going to be leaving their colony to find an overwintering site because, you know, um, sorry. I think maybe I want to back up a little bit. I got a little bit lost when I was talking. um, I hope that answered the question. Do you think I missed anything, Amber?
No, I think that's fine. And yeah, I think this was just specific to bumblebees. I think just
Yeah.
wondering maybe they meant other types of like the workers or the males or not, if it was just the queen bumblebee that overwinters.
Oh, yes. So, yeah, I can definitely answer that. So for bumblebees, the queen is going to be overwintering. The males and the workers and the old queen, they all die at the end of the year. So they are not around during the winter. That's in temperate systems. Tropical systems are a little different because you can have colonies that live for more than a year. So, it's not necessarily true in all situations, but in temperate systems, the queens are the only ones that overwinter.
Thanks, Jenny. All right, Chris is wondering, and a few other people asked this question as well. If a queen in her overwintering cavity or wherever she's overwintering gets accidentally disturbed through gardening activities in the fall or really any time of year, will this disruption negatively affect her overwintering state and success? And do you have any advice for folks that might find an overwintering bumblebee, what they should do with it?
Yeah, so I would say if you find an overwintering bumblebee, my advice is to just put it back where you found it. If you can, try to keep the hibernacula intact. So, you know, they do make like a little cavity in which they're overwintering. So if you can kind of just pop them back into that cavity, that is the best way to handle it. If the cavity has been completely destroyed and the soil is really loose, I would say just sort of put them back in the dirt in the same position if you can, in which you found them. If you do disturb a queen, there is a chance that she can still survive until the next year. So um, it's best to leave them where they are. You don't want to like take them and put them in your refrigerator or something like that to release them later. It's best to just leave them where they are if you can.
Thanks for that, Jenny. Yeah, a lot of people were wondering similarly. Another question here. Pam wants to know, do they freeze in the soil over winter? Do they have some type of antifreeze?
Yeah, so in preparation for overwintering, queens will accumulate antifreeze in their tissues. So their tissues are not freezing solid or anything like that. They enter hibernation and they go through a state of arrested development where they are not frozen, but they're also not, active or doing anything at all. And they have those glycogen reserves that helps protect them from frost.
All right, you answered that one really quickly. I was still reading. Okay, next question. Rachel is wondering, do queens ever nest in lawns? And how does mowing affect those bees? How do fertilizers, not pesticides or herbicides, but strictly nitrogen, etc., fertilizer affect them?
So I don't know the answer to the fertilizer question, unfortunately. But bumblebees do nest in lawns. I don't know about you all, but there are definitely things like rabbit nests and chipmunk burrows in my lawn. And so bumblebees can use those substrates to nest in. certainly bumblebee nests have been found in lawns. So bumblebees can nest in your lawn. It is possible. Mowing, if they are under the ground, shouldn't impact them too much. They might get a little disoriented right after you mow because you've removed any landmarks around the nest entrance that they would be using to orient themselves to where that nest entrance is. So after you mow, you might see some worker bees buzzing around a little bit lost, but it's not likely to destroy the nest. For surface nesters, it's a little that I think there is the potential that mowing could destroy the nest if you're mowing too close to the ground. So if you have a surface nesting bee, I would say if you want to conserve that nest, maybe mow around it. There's also the possibility that if the nest is on the surface of the ground, you could squish it with your mower. So, if you are on like a riding lawnmower or something like that, you might just run over the nest because they don't have soil over the top of them to protect them. They just have that canopy of, grass or compost there. So I would say for the surface nests, the big worry would be running them over and squishing them or destroying the nest by mowing. So, but most nests in your lawn are probably going to be below the ground because you're probably not going to have any thatch or surface materials in your lawn for the for the bumblebee to use to nest in.
Thanks, Jenny. Those are good considerations. All right. Heather would like to know, when does overwintering happen? When temperatures reach a certain point?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we don't always know the answer to that. And it's probably depends on the species to some degree. Um, so I can tell you from personal experience monitoring common eastern bumblebee nests in Ipswich that the queens overwintered at depending on like their emergence times. So I had some colonies where queens were being produced sort of earlier in the summer, and those queens they were overwintering right next to their nest site entrance, so I could see them making their overwintering sites, and I knew generally when queens from that nest were starting their overwintering period. And for colonies that started reproducing earlier, that overwinter, like when I would see queens digging out their hibernacula, it depended on when queens were emerging. So for that species, I think it's more based on when the queens emerge. Um, Certainly, you don't see that many queens of short-lived colonies out and about during the fall. So, some bumblebee colonies, they will uh, last a really long time, all through the summer and into the fall. Some bumblebee colonies are a little bit shorter lived, so they're lasting just through the summer. You don't see those short-lived queens from those short-lived colonies, you're not seeing them flying around um, on flowers or anything like that in the fall. They just kind of disappear from the landscape. So I would assume that they are going into hibernation, even though it's still warm out.
Right. Stephen is wondering, how does the potential for wetter winters and potential flooding affect ground nesting bumblebees? Is there any evidence that those species that sometimes nest above ground are adapting to wetter conditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for below ground nesting species, I usually like chipmunk burrows are constructed in a way that helps prevent flooding. So the way that chipmunks and other animals tunnel, they also don't like their burrows to be flooded. So there are some kind of safeguards there for the below ground nesting species. Um, but flooding can happen. I don't think we have a lot of empirical data on what happens to nest sites when they become flooded, but I would imagine that they are probably destroyed. There is some cool research on flooding and overwintering queens. So there's a recent study where somebody went and took overwintering queens, and then submerged them for long periods of time and saw whether or not they survived. And they actually survived a long time after being submerged, which I think is crazy, like days. So they may be a little bit more, at least the overwintering queens may be somewhat resilient to flooding. Although, I don't know, that was a lab-based study, and, a wet queen all winter long might just die. I'm not sure. Um, but that is definitely an area where I think we could use more research for sure.
Yeah, I do remember hearing about that. That was really fascinating.
Yeah,
More to learn
wild.
there. Yeah,
Yeah, I would
exactly.
never expect that.
All right, we have a lot of questions about pre-built nesting structures, whether it's like an upturned pot filled with straw or bumblebee houses. A lot of people are wondering, would a typically ground nesting bee use a structure like this if it was provided? Would they be able to find it?
Yeah, so those are great questions. Bumblebees will use things like bird boxes and, human-made structures to nest in. Um, I think a lot of the time, the bees that are using those above ground nest boxes are going to be above ground nesting bees. So the tree bumblebee in Europe is a species that uses above ground boxes a lot. Um, I can't say I can't I think that we just don't have enough research out there, to really say how often, like, I don't think we have enough research to really say whether or not those above ground nest sites are good for bumblebees. They certainly use them, but they can become like overheated. So if you have a bird box that is in the full sun, it might be overheated. So I would say if you're interested in creating habitat, nesting habitat for bumblebees, the best thing to do is to create habitat for other wildlife. So birds and chipmunks and other animals. You know, I also think it's more fun to think about making habitats for those animals too. Um, so that is the way I would recommend creating nesting habitat for bumblebees. Um, but certainly they do use boxes. Uh, I think how often bumblebees use those boxes is really dependent on the region. I have gone out and put out a lot of boxes for bumblebees myself, and out of hundreds of boxes that I put up, I think one bumblebee colony ended up using it. So I didn't find that it worked super well personally, but there are areas in Canada where folks have had a lot of success getting bumblebees to colonize nest boxes. Um, so I think it really just depends on the study system.
All right, I have sort of two questions. A lot of people are, first of all, wondering for all of these observations that folks can make on iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch, are those helpful in Canada as well as the United States? We have a lot of folks, I think, from Canada and from other countries on this webinar, which is great.
Yeah, so Bumblebee Watch is focused on North American bumblebees. So Canada, yes. Other countries, I would post your observations to iNaturalist. If you do want to submit an observation to Bumblebee Watch, definitely try to take some photos of the nest. So you want to take photos that show the actual nest itself and photos of the bees that are using the nest so that we can actually verify what species of bumblebee is using that nest site. It can be a little bit hard to take good photos of nest sites, but what I recommend doing is using a camera or like your camera phone and taking a video of the nest entrance for a while. And from that, you can usually get pretty good screenshots of the bumblebees as they're leaving or entering.
And then the same question for Queen Quest, if folks from Canada can be putting their observations in there.
Yeah, I think I'm not as sure about Queen Quest, but I imagine that you could if you were in Canada. So yeah, I would encourage you to fill that out, even if you are in Canada.
Okay, and then sorry, Amber, I just have a few follow-up questions. I'm just going to keep going with the community science train here. So this person said, oof, a lot of reporting options, Bumblebee Atlas, iNaturalist, Queen Watch, and now Bumblebee Watch. If all of them, which one would you recommend using?
Yeah. So if you find an overwintering bumblebee, I would say submit it to Queen Quest. And then if you find a nest, I would say submit it to Bumblebee Watch. Uh, I love iNaturalist, super pro iNaturalist. But on Bumblebee Watch, you can fill out a lot of additional information. So what substrate the bumblebee was using to nest in, where it was found, is it in a forest or in a grassland? And that information isn't going to be as easy to extract from iNaturalist as it would be from Bumblebee Watch. So um, I think the value in using those other platforms is giving researchers as much information as you can about your sighting because they're really special and really cool and really rare. So we want to get as much as we can out of them.
Okay, and then last question. Mary's wondering if iNaturalist data feeds into Bumblebee Watch, and I assume they might be asking because some people have their own iNaturalist profile and have lots of observations. Should they be double, like posting on both of them, or is just iNaturalist good enough?
Yeah, so I would say probably just pick one or the other. Um, for if you are involved in the Atlas program, you definitely want to be using Bumblebee Watch. But if you are just submitting a sighting of a bumblebee that you stumbled upon in your garden or your yard, you can use either, whichever ones you're more comfortable with, I think is fine. All of that information does get used by researchers. So, it's really up to you which platform you would prefer to use if you're just submitting an observation of like a worker bee. Um, yeah, I would just say I wouldn't double document if you can avoid it.
Thanks for explaining all that. There are a lot of different platforms to use.
There's so many.
Okay, another question. Someone wants to know, does depth of overwintering sites vary depending on winter or cold or snow severity?
Yeah, I would say we definitely don't know enough about bumblebee overwintering, I think, to really get at that question, but it's a really good one and one that I personally am super curious about. Bumblebee overwintering depths vary, so sometimes you'll find bumblebees right below like the leafy duff in like a forest floor, like they're literally just a couple centimeters below the surface. And then some of them are a little bit deeper, so 15 centimeters is a lot deeper than a couple centimeters. But I don't think we know why some bumblebees like to dig a little farther than others.
All right, I like this question, and several people sort of had a similar one. Mindy is wondering what resources are there to learn about supporting bumblebees with creating environments for them to nest in?
Yeah, so we have a lot of really great publications on the Xerces website. There's a specific publication on bumblebee nesting and overwintering that I suggest you all check out. Could we maybe drop that in the chat or send it out in like the follow-up email potentially? Um, would be a good idea. Yeah, Xerces has a lot of really great resources and documents on, how to enhance nesting and overwintering habitat. So I definitely recommend that you all check that out.
Thanks. I'll ask another question while I think it looks like Rachel's typing. How do you look for a nest?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about looking for worker activity outside of the nest entrance. So when you are actively looking for nests, what I like to do is to just walk around and look for worker bees sort of flying towards the ground. So usually when you see worker bees out and about, they're buzzing around from flower to flower. If you see a bee going to the ground, or if you suddenly see a bee like sort of zooming up from the ground, that's a good sign that you maybe have encountered a nest. Um, Sometimes workers will do this kind of like circular flyby around a nest entrance. So you'll see a bee kind of zooming towards you, and then all of a sudden it'll kind of circle a little bit and then go to the ground. That's a really common flight pattern that you'll see workers as they're approaching their nest entrances. Um, I also find that listening can be helpful when I'm looking for nests. So for surface nests, sometimes you can hear the bees buzzing like at the on the ground. Um, and so what I like to do is just kind of listen really carefully for sounds coming near the ground of the buzzing sound. Uh, I think that that's also really helpful for finding nests. And then like I have accidentally stepped on a nest on one occasion. It was a surface nest, and all of a sudden it just like vibrated beneath my shoe. Um, so oh, feeling like feeling for nests, I guess you can also do.
All right. Paul is wondering if there's any indication of bumblebees nesting or trying to nest in corn or soybean fields, wondering if they might be attracted to the pre-harvest only to be tilled up post-harvest. The majority of land in their area is predominantly used for agriculture, and it might be hard to survey or research.
Yeah, so I cannot think of any records of nests from corn or soy. The croplands that we have nest records from, I think generally tend to be a little bit less intensive. So there are lots of records of nests from banana plantations. So, those are forested agricultural lands. There are lots of trees growing in them. Rice paddies are another place where people have found lots of nests, and they've found them sort of in the um like not in the patty itself, but in the sort of board, like I can't think of the word. It's like the of the banks around the patty that separate them. So they found nests there, and there have also been some nests found in like rye fields before. Um, so they can nest in agricultural areas, but I think most of the records that we have of nests are from agricultural areas that are not like super intensively plowed, like you would see for like a corn field or a soybean field.
Okay, I'm going to try and summarize a couple different questions here. Can you maybe go over again the difference between overwintering cavities and nesting sites for the new colony? Some people were wondering if the overwintering cavities will be used by the queen in the new colony the next year. So if you could explain the differences there.
Yeah, we so when we think of like the nest site, that's going to be where the whole colony lives during the summer. The overwintering sites for bumblebees, the queens, from what we can tell from our very few records that we have of overwintering queens, it seems like the queens leave their natal nest sites and then find their own spot to overwinter, and they will dig themselves into the soil. Um, I think a lot of researchers are curious as to whether or not some queens overwinter in their nest sites. Um, because it is a possibility. We don't really know if they do that or not because we just haven't done a lot of research in that area, but I personally know a lot of folks who think that queens could potentially be overwintering in their natal nest sites. Um, Certainly for solitary bee species, their nesting and overwintering sites are the same. So for stem nesting bees, as I was trying to talk about a little bit earlier, I don't think I did a good job, but so for stem nesting bees, they nest in the stems. They often overwinter in the stems too. Like they don't, boom, they're overwintering as larvae or as adult bees in those same stems, in their natal stems. Or for ground nesting bees, they'll often overwinter in their natal nest. So a female bee will build a nest, she'll have offspring, and they will stay in that nest all winter long and then emerge in the spring. So the nest sites and the overwintering sites are the same for lots and lots of solitary bees. For bumblebees, it's kind of weird that they're not the same. So maybe some of the queens are staying there in their natal nest the whole winter. We just don't know.
All right, this next question is from Amy. Could you say anything about the work being done on using dogs to find nests? Any specifics that it works? Yeah.
Yeah, so I There have been some studies where people have gone out and used sniffer dogs to try to find bumblebee nests. So bumblebee nests, they have a smell, and you can train a dog to try to find that smell out and about in the landscape. So I know at least one person who is trying to use sniffer dogs to find nests. My former grad advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Crone, she tried to teach her dog to find nests, but we like did like a sniffer dog training with Molly. um, so folks do use dogs to try to help them find nests. I think in our experience, the dogs were about as good as a person at finding the nests. So they could definitely find some nests. Um, but also people can find nests too, and the rate of return is about the same for both of them. But dogs are very cute, and it does get people really excited about conservation. And it is really cool that they can find nest sites. So it's definitely super awesome. Maybe there's like a dog out there who's super talented at finding bumblebee nests that we haven't found yet. So, if they're out there, I hope someday they find their perfect dog job of sniffing out bumblebee nests. But I think whether or not it's worth all of the effort, I think it just depends on how much you like dogs. Or if you'd rather have a dog look for the nest versus you look for the nest yourself.
Okay, Pat is wondering, and we had a couple questions like this too. If only the queen survives or only the queen overwinters, then how does the colony start back up in the spring?
Yeah, so the queen bumblebees mate before they overwinter. So the queen has sperm in her body stored for springtime. So when she emerges from overwintering, she can then use that sperm when she finds a nest site and starts laying eggs. That's when she uses the sperm to produce her offspring. So the males, they kind of, in a way, survive to the next year, not in their physical body, but in their genetics um, that the queen stores in her body.
All right. Thank you for that. Sorry, I'm just reading through these. We have so many coming in. Let's see here. You answered that one. Someone asked about mulching. If mulching can destroy nests and if they need to mulch, is there a time that could be less lethal?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I guess for mulching like leaves or leaf piles.
They did not specify.
Okay. So bumblebees are going to be active, most of the late spring through the summer into fall. So I wouldn't do your mulching at the peak of summer, but come September, come August, that would probably I think be a good time because if there is a big bumblebee colony in your yard, you'll probably notice it by then. You'll see some workers flying in and out. So because of that, you wouldn't need to worry about accidentally mulching a nest because, probably by that time you might have noticed it already if it's doing well. So yeah, I would say if you can wait until then, that's when I would do it. If you wait, till winter time, there might be queens in your yard depending on what you're trying to mulch, like under the soil. So I think I would recommend doing it sort of later in the summer if you can.
Thanks, Jenny. And we've talked about this a little bit, or you've talked about this a little bit, but really explicitly, how can we not disturb bumblebees overwintering? Are there signs to find the nests if the holes are covered in forests versus meadows?
So I'm sorry, was this a question about nests or overwintering sites? Sorry.
Holes. So I don't know if that's just the entrance hole for the overwintering. It's about the overwintering sites. How can we not disturb them overwintering?
Yeah, so I would say the big thing to do is to not till or, disturb the soil too much. So if you're doing anything that disturbs the soil, you might be knocking a queen out of her hibernacula or something like that because they are in the soil and they are often just a few inches below the soil surface. Um, that being said, sometimes you do have to like dig in your garden or dig things up. So it is pretty unlikely that you are going to encounter an overwintering queen when you're doing your digging. So I wouldn't worry about it a ton if there are things that you need to do in your garden, but I wouldn't go and like till your whole garden in the winter time if you can avoid it.
This is going to be a hard question, but do you have any advice for people who are trying to actually survey for overwintering bees?
Yeah, so I would say if you're gonna look for overwintering bees, um, I think they're gonna be the most visible when they're looking for an overwintering site and digging out their overwintering site. So, at this time of year in the fall, there may still be some bumblebee queens out looking for places to overwinter. So, if you're on a walk or something like that, just keeping your eyes peeled for queens near the ground. So, if you see a queen fly by and then drop to the ground all of a sudden, and you see her digging around in the soil, that could be a good sign that you're seeing a queen looking for an overwintering site. Um, I do know a few researchers who have gone and tried to dig around looking for overwintering queens, like actually go and dig with the intention of trying to find queens. And they did find some queens doing that, but you cannot do that in every place in the United States. In areas where the rusty patch bumblebee is present, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, you're not supposed to dig in the soil to look for queens, so please don't do that if you are in any place or any region where the rusty patch bumblebee could potentially be present. Um, so I think probably the best thing to do is really look for them when they're trying to dig their overwintering sites and look for queens sort of flying near the ground, doing that digging behavior.
Thanks. That's a good segue into this one. We had a couple questions about sites for overwintering queens and digging their overwintering sites. Differences in recommendations over the past to leave bare ground areas in your garden for overwintering bees. But from your presentation, it appears that maybe we should be leaving the leaves more. Multiple people had questions similar to that. So, which would support overwintering bees more?
Yeah, I think that is a really tough question. You know, where there are areas where there aren't a lot of leaves, it's a lot easier to find overwintering bees, right? Because the leaves aren't in the way, you can see the overwintering sites. So, I think probably leaving the leaves would be your better bet, as opposed to leaving bare ground. Definitely, like in my experience, like watching common eastern bumblebee queens dig out hibernacula around nest sites, they didn't seem to mind the leaves at all. They just kind of, themselves in there and then dug their little hibernacula and they were totally fine. Um, so I would say, they probably need looser soil. And I'm just speaking from personal experience where there were nest sites near a trail, the queens, they were not digging on the compacted soil. They were digging in the softer, looser soil that they could get into. So, I would say, soft soil, covered with leaves, that's probably a great spot for overwintering queens.
All right, so Linda has a question, and I appreciate this. Linda says, so is this the takeaway? Have a large variety of habitat as possible and as undisturbed as possible to aid bumblebees? It seems like lots of people are asking, like, what can they do in their yard? Do you think that that is probably the best advice?
Yeah, so I think so if I were gonna make my yard a place for nesting and overwintering bumblebees, what I would do is try to plant a lot of diverse plants. So, we talk a lot about wildflowers and planting wildflowers for bees, but planting trees, planting bunch grasses, planting other types of plants that are going to support the other fauna in your yard would be one of, I think, my first step if I was going to try to make my yard a bumblebee friendly place for nesting and overwintering bees. I would say participating in programs like Leave the Leaves is also really helpful. You don't want to disturb the soil too much if you care about what's going on underneath it. Um, but I also don't want to tell people not to do any disturbing at all. Uh, at least in the Midwest, prescription fire is a really important habitat management tool. And that is in some ways destructive. Like you're burning a lot of habitat. You are, burning the leaves on at a site. You're burning surface nesting sites potentially, but it's still really important as a management tool because you're keeping invasives from moving in. You are keeping woody plants from taking things over. Uh, just because disturbance can have some negative impacts, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it all of the time. You just have to be careful about your practices. So, instead of digging up your whole yard, you can implement like a rotational strategy. So, if you want to dig up an area in your yard, don't dig up the whole thing at once. You can just do part of it one year and then part of it another year. And that will also help you in getting the stuff that you need to do in your yard done without, well, still sort of minimizing the impacts to the bees that you care about.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, we are running close to time here, so we only have time for a few more questions. A couple people from different parts of the country were asking this, and I wonder if you can speak to what types of nesting structures or overwintering sites are common for species that live more in the arid Southwest, in Mediterranean climates, in California, places that don't have as much loose fluff or duff layers, where the winters are more mild.
Yeah. So I mentioned that we don't have a ton of data on nesting and overwintering. We really, really have not hardly any data at all in the Western United States in particular, especially in arid regions. That is a huge knowledge gap. Um, I can think of maybe one or two records of bumblebee nests from arid regions, and I think one nest was under like a sagebrush. And like that's literally all I could tell you about bumblebee nesting in arid places. So um, I can't unfortunately answer that question, but if you are in the Southwest, I really encourage you, if you find a nest or an overwintering site, to record it because your data is so important, especially in that region.
All right, well, we have time for one more question, keeping you a little bit later than we thought, but so many good questions from folks. And I love this question because I'm curious as well. Cedar is wondering, what do bumblebee nests smell like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've only ever smelled them when they're done for the season and they get a little bit moldy. So I think they smell kind of bad. Um, they smell like old, musty smelling stuff. Um, I think the fresher colonies probably smell a little bit better. Whenever I've caught a queen bumblebee, like doing research, I always think the queen bumblebees smell really, really good. So they smell like honey and, pollen and flowers in the best way. So I imagine that they get that scent partially from the nest, but I'm not sure about that. So, in my dreams, the nests smell good, but I don't think they actually smell that good. They kind of smell bad, but
It's totally fair. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you to our audience for all of your wonderful questions. It's clear that people are very passionate about bumblebees, and we appreciate that. It takes all of us to save them, truly. So yeah, thank you for sharing this work with us and for the work you do at Xerces. It's much appreciated. I've learned a lot, and it's been a really wonderful way to spend the morning with you. So thank you so much.
thanks for having me, guys.